The morning of November 20th, 1943, on Tarawa Atoll, Staff Sergeant Robert Sherrod crouched in a shell crater that still smelled of cordite and coral dust. Around him, the 2nd Marine Division was counting bodies. Not just Japanese bodies, though there were thousands of those scattered across Battallion's blood-soaked beaches, but American bodies too. Over 1,000 Marines dead in 76 hours of fighting for an island barely 2 miles long. Sherrod was a war correspondent, and he'd seen combat before. But nothing had prepared him for the industrial mathematics of this battle. He watched a mortar crew from the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, methodically cleaning their 81mm tube. They'd fired over 2,000 rounds in 3 days. The gun captain, a corporal from Nebraska with hands wrapped in bloody bandages, told Sherrod something that would stick with him for the rest of his life. "We put more steel on this island in one afternoon than the Japanese could throw at us in a month," the corporal said, his voice flat with exhaustion, and they still kept coming. That simple observation contained a truth that would define the Pacific War's remaining 2 years. The United States Marine Corps had developed a form of portable firepower so overwhelming, so mathematically superior to anything the Imperial Japanese Army possessed, that it fundamentally altered the nature of island combat. At the heart of this revolution sat an unglamorous weapon, the Battalion Mortar. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By late 1943, a standard Marine infantry battalion deployed with a weapons company containing 8 81mm mortars. Each rifle company added 3 60mm mortars. That meant 11 heavy tubes per battalion, not counting the lighter company mortars that could be carried by individual squads. The ammunition expenditure was staggering. On Tarawa alone, Marine mortar crews fired an estimated 45,000 rounds in less than 4 days. Compare this to the typical Japanese infantry battalion's indirect fire capability. Intelligence assessments from captured documents and post-battle surveys revealed that most Japanese battalions in the Pacific Theater operated with 2, sometimes 3, Type 97 81mm mortars, not 11, not 8, 2 or 3, and often, by 1943, even those were in short supply. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was philosophical, industrial, and ultimately psychological. American military doctrine had embraced the mortar as a democratization of artillery, putting heavy fire support directly in the hands of battalion and company commanders. Japanese doctrine, rooted in different tactical traditions and constrained by different industrial realities, had made different choices. Neither choice was inherently wrong. But on the killing grounds of the Central Pacific, where naval bombardment could only do so much, and where every yard of coral had to be taken by infantrymen on foot, the difference between 11 mortars and 2 mortars was often the difference between victory and annihilation. Sherrod didn't know it that morning in the shell crater, but he was witnessing a mathematical truth that would repeat itself across dozens of islands. Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The pattern would remain consistent. Overwhelming American mortar firepower meeting desperate Japanese resistance, with the outcome decided not by courage, which both sides possessed in terrible abundance, but by simple, brutal arithmetic. To understand how this firepower disparity emerged, you have to go back to the 1930s, when both nations were developing their infantry doctrine for the wars they expected to fight. The United States Marine Corps, tasked with amphibious operations against fortified positions, recognized early that traditional artillery support would be problematic in the critical first hours of a beach assault. Heavy guns couldn't land with the first waves. Naval gunfire, while devastating, couldn't provide the responsive, close-in support that infantry commanders needed when they were pinned down 300 yards from a machine gun nest. The solution was the mortar, a simple tube that could drop high-explosive shells in a high arc, allowing it to reach behind cover and into trenches. More importantly, it was portable. A 60mm mortar weighed just 42 pounds, complete with baseplate and bipod. 2 men could carry it. An 81mm mortar, the real workhorse, weighed 136 pounds, broken down into 3 components: A single squad could manhandle it across a beach under fire. The Marine Corps didn't invent the mortar, but by the late 1930s, they'd made it central to their fighting doctrine. Training exercises at Quantico and the new amphibious warfare schools placed heavy emphasis on indirect fire coordination. Forward observers were trained to call in mortar strikes with the same precision that artillery officers directed their big guns. Ammunition production ramped up. By 1942, American factories were producing mortar rounds by the millions. Japanese military thinking had evolved along different lines. The Imperial Army's experience in China and Manchuria had taught them to value mobility and shock tactics. Their infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive night attacks, infiltration, and close combat where Japanese fighting spirit, the concept of seishin, would overcome material disadvantages. Heavy weapons were valued, certainly, but the emphasis was on machine guns and the Type 89 grenade discharger, the so-called knee mortar, which wasn't actually a mortar at all but a specialized grenade launcher. This wasn't ignorance or backwardness. Japanese military planners understood modern warfare, but they were working within constraints that American planners didn't face. Japan's industrial base was a fraction of America's size. Steel was precious. Every kilogram of metal had to be carefully allocated between ships, aircraft, tanks, and infantry weapons. When you're choosing between more Zero fighters or more mortars, and when your naval aviation commanders are promising to win the war with carrier strikes, mortars often came second. There was also a cultural dimension that's easy to misunderstand. Japanese tactical manuals from the period emphasized closing with the enemy, using terrain and darkness to negate firepower advantages. A 1941 infantry manual captured on Guadalcanal explicitly stated that prolonged firefights played to American strengths. Better to infiltrate close, launch a sudden assault, and decide the battle with bayonets and grenades where American firepower couldn't be brought to bear. This wasn't stupidity. It was adaptation to reality. If you know you can't win a firepower duel, you change the fight. Japanese infantry in China had successfully employed these tactics against numerically superior Chinese forces. The problem was that the Marines they'd face in the Pacific weren't Chinese infantry, and the islands where they'd fight didn't offer the kind of terrain where infiltration tactics worked well. By mid-1943, the Imperial Japanese Army was also facing a logistics nightmare that American forces simply didn't experience. Shipping was being strangled by submarine warfare. Every cargo vessel lost to American torpedoes was a vessel that couldn't carry ammunition, food, or replacement weapons to the garrisons scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Priority went to aviation fuel and aircraft parts. Mortars and mortar ammunition, heavy and bulky, were lower on the list. The industrial numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1943 alone, American factories produced approximately 65,000 81mm mortars and over 20 million rounds of mortar ammunition. Japanese production figures for the same period, compiled from post-war industrial surveys, show roughly 8,000 Type 97 mortars produced, with ammunition production perhaps 1/20th of American levels, and this was production for an army fighting across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific simultaneously. What this meant in practical terms was that even when Japanese units were authorized to have mortars on their tables of organization, they often didn't have them. Or they had the mortars, but not the ammunition. Or they had both, but the ammunition was still sitting in a warehouse in Rabaul or Truk, while the unit that needed it was digging in on some coral atoll 500 miles away. American Marines faced no such constraints. The logistics apparatus supporting them was the most powerful in human history. Ammunition ships, the unglamorous workhorses of the Pacific Fleet, carried tens of thousands of tons of mortar rounds forward to the battle zones. When a Marine mortar crew ran low on ammunition, they requested resupply and usually had it within hours. The concept of ammunition shortage was so foreign to American forces that the standard operating procedure was to fire as many rounds as the tactical situation warranted. This created a feedback loop that Japanese commanders found deeply disturbing. Marine infantry doctrine encouraged aggressive use of mortars. Company commanders who conserved ammunition were considered overly cautious. The goal was to saturate enemy positions, to make it impossible for Japanese defenders to move, to reinforce, to even lift their heads above their fighting positions. And because ammunition was plentiful, this kind of sustained bombardment was not just possible, but standard practice. Japanese after-action reports, the ones that survived and were captured or recovered after the war, reveal a growing awareness of this disparity and a kind of horrified fascination with American firepower. A report from a battalion commander on Kwajalein, found in a dugout after the battle in February 1944, described facing continuous mortar bombardment of intensity never before experienced. Another report, from a company commander on Saipan, noted that American mortar fire was so sustained and accurate that movement during daylight became impossible. These weren't exaggerations. At Kwajalein, the 4th Marine Division's after-action report documented that mortar crews fired an average of 1,200 rounds per tube over the course of the 3-day battle. Some crews exceeded 2,000 rounds. For the Japanese defenders, who might have a few hundred mortar rounds total for their entire garrison, this kind of expenditure was incomprehensible. The psychological impact went beyond simple fear of the explosions themselves. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hardship, to face death with courage. But there's a particular kind of helplessness that comes from being on the receiving end of firepower you cannot answer. You can steel yourself to charge a machine gun nest. You can prepare yourself for a banzai charge. But how do you maintain fighting spirit when shells rain down hour after hour, when every attempt to move draws immediate fire, when your own mortars can manage perhaps a dozen rounds before running dry while the Americans seem to have an infinite supply? This was the psychological reality that would define the island campaigns of 1944 and 45. Not just that American forces had more mortars, though they did. Not just that they had more ammunition, though that too was true. But that the sheer, overwhelming disproportion of firepower created a kind of industrial helplessness that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 11 mortars versus 2 or 3, thousands of rounds versus hundreds, continuous fire support versus sporadic bombardment. And the Marines who served those mortars, men like that corporal in the shell crater on Tarawa, understood what they represented. Not individual heroism, though there was plenty of that, but something newer and in its way more terrible. The industrial capacity of American warfare made manifest in a simple steel tube that could throw 5-pound shells of high explosive 2 miles with deadly accuracy. To understand what this firepower disparity meant in concrete terms, you need to look at the men who operated these weapons and the mathematics of their deployment. Consider 2nd Lieutenant James Russell, a mortar platoon commander with the 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division. Russell kept a detailed diary throughout the Marshall Islands campaign, portions of which were later deposited in the Marine Corps Historical Center archives. Russell's platoon in early 1944 consisted of 3 sections, each operating 2 81mm M1 mortars. That's 6 tubes under his direct command. Each mortar had a crew of 5 men, a squad leader, gunner, assistant gunner, and 2 ammunition carriers. The gunner's job was precision itself. He adjusted elevation and traverse using calibrated dials that could place rounds within a 25-yard radius at ranges up to 3,000 yards. The assistant gunner handled the actual dropping of rounds down the tube. The ammunition carriers, despite their title, did far more than carry shells. They maintained ammunition stocks, prepared fuses, and during intense fire missions became part of a human conveyor belt, feeding rounds to the gun. Russell's diary entry from January 31st, 1944, the first day of the Kwajalein assault, provides remarkable detail. His platoon came ashore in the 3rd wave, carrying their mortars in sections across the beach, while under sporadic Japanese fire. Within 40 minutes of landing, they had all 6 tubes operational and had established communication with forward observers. By noon, they'd fired 800 rounds. By sunset, over 1,500. The logistics of this were extraordinary. Each 81mm round weighed just under 7 pounds. 1,500 rounds meant over 10,000 pounds of ammunition expended in one day by one platoon. This ammunition didn't magically appear. It came ashore in the fourth and fifth waves, carried by shore party details, who manhandled wooden crates from landing craft to forward dumps. Each crate held 8 rounds. That meant nearly 200 crates just for Russell's platoon on day one. Now compare this to the Japanese side. Intelligence reports compiled from interrogations of prisoners taken at Kwajalein revealed that the typical Japanese infantry battalion defending the atoll had 2 Type 97 81mm mortars. These were capable weapons, nearly identical in performance to the American M1. The Type 97 could fire a 7-pound shell to ranges exceeding 3,000 yards. Japanese mortar crews were well trained, often veterans of years of fighting in China, but they operated under crippling constraints. The standard ammunition allocation for a Japanese mortar on Kwajalein was 300 rounds total, not 300 rounds per day, 300 rounds for the entire battle. Once those rounds were expended, the mortar was a useless steel tube, and unlike American units, which could request resupply and receive it within hours, Japanese defenders had only what was already on the island. When it was gone, it was gone. The mathematical disparity becomes even starker when you calculate rates of fire. A well-trained marine mortar crew could sustain 15 rounds per minute for short periods. More typically, they'd maintain 4 to 6 rounds per minute during extended fire missions. Russell's diary notes that during a particularly intense 3-hour bombardment on February 1st, his 6 mortars averaged 5 rounds per minute, delivering nearly 5,400 rounds onto Japanese positions in one afternoon. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A Japanese battalion with 2 mortars and 300 rounds total couldn't match even 1 hour of that bombardment. The math was simple and devastating. 6 American mortars with effectively unlimited ammunition versus 2 Japanese mortars with sharply limited stocks. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was existential. The ammunition itself tells part of the story. Marine mortar crews had access to multiple shell types. High explosive was standard, but they also carried white phosphorus for marking targets and creating smoke screens and illumination rounds for night operations. Each shell type served a specific tactical purpose, and forward observers were trained to call for the appropriate ammunition for each situation. Japanese stocks, when they existed at all, were almost entirely high explosive. Specialized rounds like illumination shells were rare luxuries. This limited tactical flexibility. American mortar crews could shift rapidly between suppression fire, smoke screens, and target marking. Japanese crews had one option: high explosive, and precious little of it. The training pipelines that produced these mortar crews also reflected the industrial disparity. Marine mortar training at Camp Lejeune and Camp Pendleton emphasized live-fire exercises with abundant ammunition. Trainees fired thousands of practice rounds, learning to adjust fire based on observer corrections to calculate deflection and elevation for various ranges and targets. By the time they deployed to the Pacific, they'd fired more rounds in training than many Japanese crews would fire in combat. The moment when Japanese commanders fully grasped the scope of this firepower, disparity came not in a single dramatic instant, but through the accumulation of bitter experience across multiple battles. But if there was one engagement where the reality became undeniable, it was Saipan in June and July of 1944. Colonel Takashi Goto commanded the 136th Infantry Regiment, part of the 43rd Division defending Saipan. Goto was a veteran officer who'd fought in China and understood combined arms warfare. His regiment's defensive positions in the Central Highlands were well constructed, taking advantage of the island's rugged terrain. He had approximately 4,000 men under his command, and according to the regiment's incomplete records recovered after the battle, 6 Type 97 mortars with an estimated 800 rounds of ammunition total. Facing him was the 2nd Marine Division, which landed on June 15th with 27 infantry battalions. Each battalion had its mortar platoon. The mathematics were staggering. Over 200 marine mortars against Goto's 6 tubes. And while Goto was rationing his 800 rounds, the 2nd Marine Division had brought ashore over 500,000 rounds of mortar ammunition in the first week alone. Goto's operations log, partially preserved and later translated, recorded his growing realization of what he faced. On June 17th, 2 days after the landing, he noted that American mortar fire was of unprecedented intensity and duration. His units reported being under continuous bombardment for hours at a time, something they'd never experienced in China, where battles were more fluid and firepower less concentrated. By June 20th, Goto's entries became more desperate. He described attempting to reinforce a position held by 3rd Battalion, only to have the movement detected by American observers who called in immediate mortar fire. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes and prevented any reinforcement. Goto estimated that over 300 rounds fell on a position perhaps 200 yards square. His own mortars, trying to provide counter-battery fire, managed perhaps 20 rounds before being ordered to cease fire to conserve ammunition. The turning point came on June 23rd, during what became known as the Battle for Mount Tapochau. Goto committed his reserve battalion to a counterattack aimed at retaking positions on the mountain's southern slope. The attack was carefully planned, launched at dawn to minimize exposure to American firepower. For the first hour, his troops made progress, infiltrating through ravines and using the broken terrain to mask their movement. Then the American mortars found them. Forward observers with the 23rd Marines, positioned on high ground with clear sightlines, called in fire from multiple battalions. Goto's log describes what followed with a kind of horrified precision. The bombardment exceeded anything I believed possible. Shells fell like rain. The ground itself seemed to erupt. Movement became impossible. Men who attempted to advance were cut down. Men who sought cover were buried. The attack dissolved not from lack of courage, but from simple impossibility of advancing through such fire. The numbers support Goto's assessment. Marine after-action reports document that mortar crews from 3 battalions participated in the bombardment. Over a 90-minute period, they fired an estimated 8,000 rounds into the counterattack zone. That's more rounds than Goto's entire regiment had for the entire battle, expended in 90 minutes against a single attack. What made this moment definitive wasn't just the firepower itself, but Goto's realization of what it represented. This wasn't an unusually heavy bombardment. This was standard American procedure. The Marines could deliver this level of fire not occasionally, as a special effort, but routinely, whenever tactical circumstances warranted. And they could sustain it indefinitely because the ammunition kept flowing ashore from the landing beaches. Goto attempted to report this reality to his division commander, but the radio message, intercepted and translated by American intelligence, reveals his struggle to make the disparity comprehensible. Enemy mortar fire exceeds our capabilities by factors too large to calculate. Our counter-battery fire is ineffective due to ammunition constraints. Request urgent resupply of mortar ammunition. The reply came back 12 hours later. No resupply possible. Defend with available resources. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through the Japanese chain of command on Saipan. Junior officers, reporting to their battalion and regimental commanders, struggled to convey the sheer volume of fire they faced. One company commander's report, found in a dugout after the battle, stated simply, "American mortar fire is continuous and inescapable. Our positions are destroyed faster than we can rebuild them. Our own mortar ammunition is exhausted. We can no longer effectively respond." This wasn't defeatism, it was accurate tactical assessment. And it pointed to a truth that Japanese military doctrine hadn't fully prepared them for, that in this kind of static, attritional combat on a confined island, firepower mattered more than fighting spirit. You couldn't infiltrate your way out of a mortar barrage. You couldn't overcome it with aggressive spirit. You could only endure it, and eventually, you would break. The Marine Corps, for its part, understood exactly what it had created. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines on Saipan, later wrote in his official report, The mortar has proven to be the most effective weapon in our arsenal for reducing fortified positions. The ability to bring sustained, heavy fire on enemy positions without exposing our troops to direct fire has fundamentally altered infantry combat. The Japanese have no effective answer to this capability. Chambers was right, and the Japanese knew it. Intercepted communications from Saipan revealed a pattern. Japanese commanders requesting permission to conduct night attacks, the only time when American firepower advantage was somewhat reduced. But even night attacks faced problems. Marine mortar crews could fire illumination rounds that turned night into day, exposing attackers to machine gun and rifle fire. And by mid-1944, many Marine units had developed doctrine for pre-registering mortar fires on likely avenues of approach, allowing them to bring down accurate fire even in darkness. The material evidence of this firepower disparity littered the battlefield. When Marines overran Japanese positions, they found mortar pits with perhaps a dozen rounds remaining, while their own ammunition dumps held thousands of rounds per gun. They found Japanese defensive positions that had been systematically destroyed by mortar fire, the fortifications reduced to rubble by the cumulative impact of hundreds of shells. Technical analysis of the crater patterns told its own story. American positions showed scattered cratering from limited Japanese mortar fire. Japanese positions showed saturation cratering, where shells had fallen so densely that craters overlapped, churning the earth into a lunar landscape. Soil analysis from these areas, conducted by combat engineers, revealed that some positions had received over 50 shells per square yard. For the individual Japanese soldier in these positions, the experience was beyond anything their training had prepared them for. They'd been taught that American soldiers were soft, that they relied too heavily on material advantages, that determined Japanese infantry could overcome firepower with spirit and tactical skill. And in some contexts, in jungle fighting where visibility was limited and distances were short, this wasn't entirely wrong. But on Saipan's open terrain, under clear skies, facing an enemy who could bring down thousands of mortar rounds on targets identified by well-trained observers, spirit wasn't enough. Training wasn't enough. Courage wasn't enough. The mathematics were too lopsided, the material disparity too vast. Colonel Goto's final log entry, dated July 6, 1944. The day before his death in the final Japanese attack reflected this bitter understanding. We have fought with all possible determination. Our soldiers have shown exemplary courage. But courage cannot overcome the weight of steel the Americans bring against us. Each Marine battalion possesses firepower that exceeds our entire regiment. This is not a battle, it is industrial execution. The phrase, industrial execution, captured something essential about what the Pacific War had become by mid-1944. Not a contest of wills or tactics or even battlefield courage, but a demonstration of industrial capacity made, manifest in thousands of tons of steel falling from the sky, delivered by simple mortar tubes, operated by well-trained crews, backed by the most powerful logistics system ever created. The aftermath of Saipan crystallized a reality that would define the remaining year of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders, those who survived to report back to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, conveyed a consistent message. American firepower superiority, particularly in mortars and artillery, had reached levels that made conventional defensive tactics obsolete. The doctrine of trading space for time, of conducting elastic defenses and organized withdrawals, simply didn't work when the enemy could saturate entire grid squares with high explosive shells. This realization triggered a shift in Japanese defensive strategy, though not in the direction American planners might have hoped. Rather than seeking ways to match American firepower, which Japan's industrial base simply couldn't support, Japanese commanders doubled down on fortification and prepared positions. If they couldn't answer American mortars with their own indirect fire, they'd build defenses deep enough and strong enough to survive the bombardment. Iwo Jima represented the fullest expression of this philosophy. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the island's defense, had studied reports from Saipan and other battles. He understood the mortar firepower disparity with painful clarity. His defensive plan reflected this understanding. Rather than beach defences that could be destroyed by naval gunfire and mortars, he built an elaborate system of tunnels and underground positions. Rather than attempting counterattacks that would expose his troops to American firepower, he ordered a purely defensive battle of attrition. The 5th Marine Division, landing on Iwo Jima in February 1945, brought with it the standard overwhelming mortar firepower. 27 infantry battalions meant over 200 mortars. Ammunition expenditure on Iwo Jima exceeded even Saipan's staggering totals. In 36 days of fighting, Marine mortar crews fired over 1 million rounds. That's roughly 1,200,000 pounds of high explosive delivered through simple steel tubes by crews who'd perfected their deadly craft. Yet, despite this unprecedented bombardment, the battle for Iwo Jima became the costliest in Marine Corps history. Kuribayashi's deep fortifications absorbed the firepower and allowed his troops to survive to continue fighting. The mortar advantage that had been so decisive on Saipan's relatively open terrain proved less dominant against an enemy who'd adapted by burrowing underground. This adaptation didn't negate the mortar's effectiveness, but it changed the calculus. Marine casualties on Iwo Jima exceeded 26,000, including nearly 7,000 dead. The Japanese still lost, their garrison of 21,000 men almost completely annihilated, but they'd found a way to partially offset the firepower disparity through engineering and tactics. Lieutenant Russell, the mortar platoon commander whose diary documented Kwajalein, also fought on Iwo Jima. His entries from that battle show a more complicated picture than the earlier island assaults. "We fire hundreds of rounds at suspected positions," he wrote on February 23rd, "but the Japanese emerge from caves and tunnels we didn't know existed. The mortars are still our most effective weapon, but the enemy has learned to minimize their exposure to them. This is a different kind of fight." The mortar crews themselves evolved throughout these campaigns. By 1945, the average Marine mortar gunner had more combat experience and had fired more rounds in training and combat than his counterparts in any other army in the world. This expertise showed in their accuracy and response times. Forward observers could call for fire and have rounds impacting within 2 minutes. Crews could shift from one target to another with practiced efficiency, walking their fire across terrain to flush out hidden positions. But expertise and firepower alone couldn't entirely overcome an enemy who'd adapted to their methods. The Japanese on Okinawa, the final major battle, employed similar deep fortification strategies. They still had virtually no mortars of their own, the industrial and logistical constraints that created the disparity having only worsened as American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines. But they'd learned to fight in ways that reduced their exposure to American indirect fire. The result was brutal attritional warfare. American firepower still dominated, still killed Japanese soldiers by the thousands, still shaped every tactical decision. But the easy victories of the Central Pacific, where overwhelming mortar fire could break Japanese resistance in days, gave way to grinding campaigns measured in weeks and months. The mathematical disparity in mortar firepower remained constant throughout the war's final year, but its psychological impact evolved. For American Marines, the mortars had become a familiar tool, something they relied on as automatically as their rifles. The overwhelming superiority in indirect fire support was simply part of the tactical landscape, a given that shaped how they approached combat. For Japanese defenders, the reality of facing this firepower had moved beyond terror into a kind of fatalistic acceptance. Intercepted diaries and letters from Okinawa show soldiers who understood they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy who could bring down steel rain at will. "We dig deeper," one soldier wrote in a letter found on his body after the battle. "We endure what we must, but we cannot win against such firepower. We can only die well." This acceptance didn't mean surrender. Japanese troops on Okinawa fought with the same determination they'd shown throughout the war. But the tone of captured documents shifted from confident assertions of eventual victory to grim acknowledgement of their role as sacrifices buying time for the homeland. The mortar firepower disparity had become so normalized, so expected, that it no longer shocked. It was simply the way the war was. The human cost of this firepower advantage is difficult to calculate precisely, but pattern analysis of Japanese casualties across the island campaigns suggests that indirect fire, mortars and artillery combined accounted for approximately 40 to 50% of all Japanese combat deaths. Mortars, specifically, being more numerous and more flexibly employed than artillery, likely caused the plurality of these casualties. Staff Sergeant Robert Sherrod, the correspondent who'd observed the mortar crews on Tarawa, continued covering the Pacific War through to its conclusion. His reporting evolved as he witnessed the firepower disparity play out across multiple campaigns. By Okinawa, he was writing not about American tactical brilliance, but about industrial grinding. "We are killing them with steel," he wrote in a dispatch from April 1945. "Not cleverly, not particularly skillfully, but relentlessly. We have more shells than they have soldiers, and we use them all." This observation, brutal in its honesty, captured the essential truth of how mortar firepower shaped the Pacific endgame. The tactical sophistication that Marine mortar crews had developed mattered, certainly. Their training and expertise made them more effective than raw firepower numbers alone would suggest. But fundamentally, they were winning because they could fire 10 shells for every one the Japanese could answer with, 100 shells, 1,000 shells. The mathematics overwhelmed everything else. After the war, military analysts from both sides studied the lessons of the Pacific Island campaigns. Japanese post-war military studies consistently identified American firepower superiority, particularly in mortars and artillery, as the decisive factor in their defeats. One study, compiled by former Imperial Army staff officers, concluded, "No amount of fighting spirit could compensate for a disparity in indirect fire support that often exceeded 10 to 1. Our soldiers fought courageously, but were systematically destroyed by firepower they could not effectively counter." American after-action analyses reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. The Marine Corps Equipment Board's post-war report stated, "The 81mm mortar proved to be the single most valuable infantry weapon in the Pacific theater. Its combination of portability, firepower, and responsiveness made it indispensable for reducing fortified positions and supporting infantry advance. Future infantry doctrine should be built around maximizing mortar effectiveness." These dry analytical conclusions represented thousands of individual deaths. Japanese soldiers buried in collapsed bunkers or shredded by shell fragments, and thousands of American lives saved because firepower could accomplish what direct assault would have cost dearly in casualties. The mortar didn't make the Pacific War humane, but it did make American victory more certain and, paradoxically, less costly in American lives than it would have been without such overwhelming firepower superiority. Colonel Takashi Goto, whose operations logs documented the realization of this disparity on Saipan, died in the final Japanese attack on July 7, 1944. His body was never identified among the thousands of Japanese dead from that attack, but his writings survived, recovered from regimental headquarters, and eventually translated and archived. They stand as testimony to the experience of facing industrial firepower with inadequate means to respond. Lieutenant Russell survived the war and returned to civilian life in Oregon. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, but in a 1978 oral history interview conducted by the Marine Corps Historical Division, he reflected on what the mortar crews had accomplished. "We were just doing our jobs," he said. "But our job was to drop high explosive on enemy positions, and we had so much ammunition that we could do it all day, every day, until there was nothing left to shoot at. I don't know if that makes me proud or sad, probably both." That ambivalence captures something important about what the mortar firepower disparity represented. On one level, it was a triumph of American industrial capacity and military planning. The ability to produce millions of mortar rounds, to ship them across the Pacific, to put them in the hands of well-trained crews who could use them with devastating effectiveness. This represented organizational and industrial achievement on a scale never before seen in warfare. On another level, it represented the industrialization of killing in its purest form. The mortar wasn't a precision weapon like a sniper rifle, or even a particularly sophisticated one like a fighter aircraft. It was a simple tube that threw explosives in a high arc. What made it devastating wasn't technological sophistication, but sheer weight of fire, the ability to saturate target areas with hundreds or thousands of shells until everything in those areas was destroyed. The Japanese soldiers who endured this bombardment, and the far greater number who didn't survive it, experienced warfare at its most impersonal and overwhelming. They couldn't see the mortar crews who were killing them, couldn't fight back effectively, couldn't do anything but endure and hope to survive. When Colonel Goto wrote about industrial execution, he was describing this reality: death delivered systematically, impersonally, with the efficiency of a factory production line. The legacy of this firepower disparity extended well beyond World War II. The Korean War, Vietnam, and later conflicts all saw American forces continuing to emphasize overwhelming fire support. The specific weapons changed, artillery and airstrikes becoming more prominent, but the underlying philosophy remained: use superior firepower to destroy the enemy while minimizing friendly casualties. The mortar crews of the Pacific War had helped establish this pattern. Whether this represents progress in warfare or simply a different form of horror is a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. What's certain is that for the Marines who crouched in shell craters on Tarawa, who climbed volcanic beaches on Iwo Jima, who pushed through the mud of Okinawa, the mortar was salvation. It was the steel rain that kept Japanese machine guns suppressed, that destroyed bunkers too strong for rifle fire to crack, that made survival possible in an environment designed for killing. And for the Japanese soldiers who faced that steel rain with 2 or 3 mortars and a few hundred rounds to answer millions, it represented a mathematics of death they couldn't escape. Not because they lacked courage or tactical skill, but because they lacked the industrial base to produce the shells, the shipping to deliver them, and the logistics to sustain the kind of fire support that American forces took for granted. That morning on Tarawa, when Staff Sergeant Sherrod watched the mortar crew cleaning their tube after firing 2,000 rounds in 3 days, he was witnessing more than just one unit's experience. He was seeing the future of the Pacific War: overwhelming American firepower meeting desperate Japanese resistance, with the outcome determined not by who wanted victory more, but by who could deliver more steel onto the battlefield. The corporal from Nebraska who told Sherrod about putting more steel on Battalion in one afternoon than the Japanese could deliver in a month understood the essential truth. So did Colonel Goto on Saipan, writing about firepower disparities too large to calculate. So did Lieutenant Russell, feeling both pride and sadness decades later about the terrible efficiency of his mortar platoon. They all understood that modern war, in the end, comes down to mathematics. And in the Pacific theatre of World War II, when it came to the mathematics of mortar firepower, the equation was never in doubt. 11 American mortars with unlimited ammunition versus 2 or 3 Japanese mortars with severely limited stocks. The answer to that equation was written across every island from Tarawa to Okinawa, in crater-churned earth and shattered fortifications, in the bodies of soldiers who fought courageously on both sides, but whose fates were determined by industrial capacity as much as battlefield valor. The steel rain fell where American mortar crews directed it, and it fell without pause, without mercy, until the war was won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.